You are listening to the new man beyond the Macho Jerk and the new Age Wimp. Your host is men's coach Tripp Lanier.
What happens when we don't accept that loss and failure are necessary for growth? What has us stay in careers and relationships way past their due date? And are we making things a lot harder than they need to be? On a recent coaching call, my client and I had a discussion about loss, failure, and letting go of our expectations for the future. At the time, I'd recently just come back to our home that was significantly damaged by Hurricane Florence, and my client was dealing with the struggles of trying to fund his startup. If you're wondering why it feels really hard to control how things are now, much less in the future, then I hope this conversation will be helpful for you.
It's great to be able to look into these dark corners instead of be delusional, right? It's not that we get stuck there, but it's just that willingness to look in there, and there's a real strength that comes with it. There's a freedom that comes with it when we realize one of my coaches, Phil Stutz, taught me this phrase: "Only the dead survive." So when we're willing to die to our expectations, when we're willing to die to our preconceived notions, then we get to survive and be reborn. And so, and that's
I see that mythological process unfolding in myself over the past, several weeks.
Yeah.
Right. I let it go. I was like, it's done. You heard me on the last call. I was like, it's done.
Right. And then you find the next iteration, right? There's the next version of what things can look like. But we do need to die to things on a regular basis. It's just part of that natural creation and destruction process, right? Yeah. If we get fixated on how things are supposed to be, and thinking life is this constant linear line moving upward, there's nothing like that in our world and in nature. So you're demonstrating, the thing I want to encourage you with is you're demonstrating this very resilient mindset. And it doesn't occur to me as this like, woe is me, up and down, kind of neurotic version that we can have. It's just like, okay, here we are. This is what it is. And then you've been willing to respond in each one of those circumstances. So I want you to see this, and I want you to internalize it, because one of the reasons we started working together was to develop your leadership skills, right? To really have you take your seat as the leader. And it's this shit. It's this stuff. It's not expecting that things will always be nice and even and upward moving. It's like, okay, I'm willing to die. I've died before.
Right.
And I will be reborn. I will be reborn as this. There is something on the other side.
That's an interesting perspective, how you can learn from and develop, right? It's probably less conscious learning, but more just personality development as you go through these phases of death and rebirth in various aspects of your life.
If you look around, you'll watch people that are resisting death, and it's always egoic, what I'm talking about here. But these people that'll stay in positions way past their due date, right? They'll stay in relationships that are way past their due date. And it's unfortunate that we lose time there. We lose decades there, because there's this question of, who am I if I'm not this person with this role or with this position or whatever it might be. And so they miss out on that opportunity to be reborn into the next phase. And it's way easier for us to sit here and talk about it in a theoretical sense, right? It's terrifying to go through those places. But if you understand it's part of the process and you practice it, it's a lot different, because most of us are just resisting like something's really wrong if this is happening. It's like, no, this is natural.
So I could see how you can identify, I'm in a death phase or a dark night, and say, yes, this is natural. Is there something more that you can do to capitalize on these periods of darkness?
I think that it ultimately comes back to connection with self, right? So if I get lost in what I believe society is expecting of me, or my partner's expecting of me, and it's all within my mind, right? if I get lost in what I should be doing or what I'm supposed to be doing, those are in quotations, that's where I will lose my authority. That's where I will lose my own inner guidance system. But if I can slow down and I can stay connected to my yes, okay, given that this is what's happened, this has been my process since this storm, is like, holy shit, this storm's really heading our way, right? There's just a realization like, this is really freaking out. Holy shit, we're evacuating, right? Holy shit, we're going into, we don't know what's next, but it just becomes a moment to moment thing. And many of us are not willing to get out of the future in order to live in the moment, or to resist this. We don't want to give up our perceived ability to control the future in order to just handle what's happening in the moment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Most of us are living years, months, weeks ahead instead of what's right now. And so I think whenever we're facing these kind of death phases, it just becomes more about what's happening right now. What's happening right now? How do I want to respond? What's my yes? And what I've found is that's really all we can do anyway, right? But the neuroses and the fucking batshit crazy anxiety stuff is always rooted in future.
Absolutely, yeah.
And most of the time we feel that powerlessness because we can't do anything in the future, right? We can only do what's now. So I'm not trying to write a fortune cookie here for you, but it really is just to come back to, all right, if I'm in this place and I don't get a handle on, I don't get to control the future, then what's the very, very next step in front of me instead of step 7 or 8? What's the very next step in front of me? And if you look at what's been helping you,
right,
that's what you've been doing. You've just been coming back to, okay, what's the very next step?
Yeah.
And so what dies is that expectation of, I'm going to control the next 8 years. It just comes down to, I'm going to work on it's right now.
Right. Yeah. So that's okay. So you can think of what was dying was my seed round plan. That's what was dying a few weeks ago. And what has been reborn is my pre-seed plan. So just as a rough approximation,
Yeah.
right? I realized that the seed round plan was dead. We thought that was going to be the answer after our Series A plan failed to get traction. But now the seed round plan failed. And it has emerged from the ashes, and it has some support, limited support. Like I said, I've got half of it committed already.
You've been agile at this process because comparatively speaking, there's been a lot less ego stickiness in this. It's not been about you. But when I've worked with other guys, there's this constant pissing match going on, which is, if I don't get around for more than 8 million, I'm a loser. There's attachments to meanings that get created.
That must be hard to get rid of.
Oh, it's huge, and it's really why I believe so many companies fail. And just because I've been on this side of it as I talk to guys, and I'm like, wow, that's going to be the reason is you're not willing to, you'd rather take an F here instead of downsize it or whatever, because that looks worse, right? So there's this self-image piece that gets protected, the attachment to the self-image piece, and that's what I mean by this death process. So they're unwilling to have that die in order to go create the freedom and the aliveness and the peace and the love that they really want.
Mm-hmm. They're attached to some vision of what success means to them.
They're attached to the meaning, their reflection of their self-image. So what does this say about me? What does this mean about me?
Yeah.
So the 8 million doesn't mean operating costs and design and blah, blah, blah. It means I'm successful because my brother did a 6 million one, right? Like whatever. Right. It's the craziest shit ever. Yes.
My round is bigger than your round.
And unfortunately, it's maybe not as obvious, but there's a lot of this stuff that's subterranean. It's in there and it's baked in, and you'll start to sense it when people are wobbly on their yes or their no, and it doesn't make any rational sense, this is it, right? So in the Star Wars compactor, that motherfucker underneath the water, like this is it. The self-image thing is the monster. And you won't know where it strikes or when it strikes.
Yeah, right. It's hard to see.
It's hard to see, but it's in there, and nobody knows what the hell's going on. But it's this. And it will destroy companies. It'll destroy marriages. It'll destroy all this stuff. It is a ruthless animal, and it's because it's a blind side.
What's been your process for making? Because everybody starts with that, right? I think some people manage to make the unconscious conscious through various practices. I'm wondering what your practice has been that's allowed you to get a handle on that. And it's really, you never get rid of it. You just, it's always with you, but it becomes less destructive in your life.
Yeah, so the most recent work I did with, so Phil's the guy that I was working with most recently, and it just sneaks up. It's like, fuck, really? There it is? Like, there it is again? That's my thing. It's like, there it is again, and it's in this form. So there's two things that show for me, which is self-image stuff, needing to appear a certain way, and I can be really blind to that. So what that does is it keeps me from asking for help. I'm the guy that can help others, but for me to ask for help, there's an unconscious belief that it means I'm needy. It means it's all shadow stuff, which is I need to hide the needy, scared, weak part of me. So I have a hard time teasing apart hey, I could use some support. I could use some help here, which is different than that collapsed, scared little boy. So it doesn't even occur to me to say, hey, who could help me here? It's like, I'm fucking on my own. Right. It's me against the world. Yeah. Which is a really fun place to live. So it shows up there. And then so the self-image piece.
Any particular practices that you found to be helpful to kind of make that
it helps to have
less impactful?
Yes, it helps to have friends, and I make them aware of this. So they push me. That push. Is this one of those things you're doing, Tripp, where you isolate? Like, oh, right. And then my own just self-awareness of when things start to feel hard, when it starts to feel like a grind, is it true that I can't be helped? Is it true that I can't be supported? So I did this morning, which is I'm basically shutting down a lot of my processes as I start to work on the book so I can just focus and knock it out. Well, there's an anxiety there, which is like, well, how do I continue to keep certain operations going so that my business can keep moving forward and new clients will show up and blah, blah, blah. And it was like, I could just ask. I could ask some of my other friends that are coaches to send me clients. I send them clients all the time, but I never asked for that. And it was like, oh, I could ask for referrals. I could start, and that needy part of me, that part of me that wants to hide the needy part goes off. Yeah, but it's like, no, don't do that. And I was like, I fucking send them clients all the time. Why wouldn't I just say, hey, I'm gonna want to shut some of this stuff down. But I also want to still have an inflow of new opportunities. Could you guys send me some? Right. And so I did that this morning, and it still felt like shit. It was just like, oh God, is that okay? Like I'm still, it doesn't mean it's going to be a yes or comfortable, but they know my shit enough to be like, oh wow, cool. Tripp's showing his belly. He can be supported here, you know?
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So that self-awareness piece, but if I actually get connected with myself, if you take the time to get connected with yourself, what am I feeling? Oh, this feels really hard. And then I have an idea what my shit is. Then it's like, oh, does it need to be this? Am I making it harder than it needs to be? Am I making it harder than it needs to be? That's typically the blind spot, which is, oh, I can only raise 8 million. I can't do 1 million. That means I'm a loser. Or I can't reach out and ask for help because that means I'm a loser. Or right? You start to look at the conditions we impose on ourselves, which are more about protecting self-image than what's needed or what's effective.
Yeah, it's helpful to make clear that on over the past few weeks and see how it was actually, even though it felt like a death, that it was actually a productive, generative process and something new emerged. So that's one of the things I love about our calls, actually. And it doesn't happen on every call, but we regularly integrate these learnings.
Yes.
Right. So that's one of the more helpful things that you do on these calls, just FYI.
Great.
It's something that I'd like to integrate into my own life, is to be able to do this myself, is to integrate these learnings, because I tend to, just not extract as much information as I can from each learning experience.
Right. It's so important. I found that it's so important because I've had the opportunity to work with certain guys for years, and I found that, like, we've been through this, right? And it's like, but they're not integrating it into their story.
Right.
And so they don't see themselves as somebody that can die and be reborn. They don't see themselves as somebody that can do X and then turn to Y. And it's like, that's all integration stuff. Even though we've done it, they just stay in firefighter mode. Mm-hmm. And it's like, that's not helping them. So it's really critical, I found, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's, it's just being able to work with people over the long term. You start to see this over and over again. It's like, that's why integration is so important. It's not just helping people get through this bump right now. If you really want to stand in this powerful place and own all your capabilities, you got to write that story. You got to write it down.
Yeah. Thank you, Tripp.
If these interviews are helping you, then please visit The New Man on iTunes and leave us a positive review so others can discover the show more easily. Thanks for listening.